Oh, oh, that's weird. I'm in a graveyard. Anyway, don't forget to like and subscribe to the bald icon.
Hi guys, it's your boy Bald Icon back at it again. Appreciate you coming to watch the video. Hope you all enjoyed it. Let's get to it. St Crispin's Church in Northampton, also known as the Greek Orthodox Church of St Neophytus the Recluse of Cyprus, was originally the chapel of St Crispin's Hospital. The hospital was built as Berrywood Lunatic Asylum in 1876 and later served as a war hospital during World War One. The chapel was designed in 1887 by Robert Griffiths in an early Gothic style. In 98, the Greek Orthodox community of Northampton purchased the chapel, which now houses interior frescoes by Henry Bird and G.B.H. Holland. St Crispin's Hospital was a large psychiatric facility on the outskirts of Duston Village in Northampton, Northamptonshire, England. It was established as Northampton Mental Hospital in 1876 and closed in 1995. The site has since been redeveloped for residential use, with a small mental health unit still remaining there. Work started on the hospital in 1873. It was designed by Robert Griffiths using a corridor layout and opened as the Northampton Mental Hospital in 1876. Additional blocks for children with mental health difficulties and for epileptics were completed in 1887. It served as a military hospital during the First World War, and after the war it became Northampton Mental Hospital. It had joined the National Health Service in 1948, and two female patient villas were completed in 1954. The hospital was used as a filming location in the 1977 series of Doctor Who, in a six-part story called The Talons of Wen Qing. The mortuary was used to present a Victorian operating theatre. Following the introduction of care in the community in the early 1980s, the hospital went into a period of decline and closed in 1995. The children's block and the superintendent's house were developed by Taylor Wimpey for residential use between 2005 and 2008, and a small area was applied for the construction of Berrywood Hospital, a modern mental health facility. In August 2014, over 80 firefighters responded to an emergency call as a large fire broke out. One of the buildings was almost seriously damaged in March 2015 after it was set on fire by arsonists. St Crispin's Asylum. St Crispin's Psychiatric Hospital in Northamptonshire opened in 1876 and was originally known as the Berrywood Asylum. The new hospital was built to take the place of the former Northampton General Asylum, which was a public subscription asylum located to the east of Northampton. Like many asylums of the day, Berrywood was self-sufficient, with its own gasworks, a large farm complex, and it even had its own graveyard. There was also housing on site for the staff, which included accommodation for the superintendent, head gardener, farm bailiff, chaplain and steward, as well as the staff of the hospital. The main asylum was erected as a variation of the corridor pavilion plan. There were two patient blocks, which were on either side of the central services and hall. The only access between these buildings was a single-storey corridors on the lower levels and open metal walkways on the upper levels. In 1884, work started to expand the site, which included a block for female epileptic patients, a new block for idiot and imbecile children, and an isolation hospital. It also included a new stable block and a fire station, as well as a mortuary and stone chapel. The new additions took over 3 years to build and were completed in 1887. During the First World War, the hospital was turned over to the military and the patients were moved to other nearby asylums. It was used extensively during this time for recovering service personnel injured in the line of duty. The asylum was handed back after the war and it was home once again to mental patients. By 1930, the asylum changed its name to St. Crispin's and was no longer known as an asylum but a mental hospital. The site was further expanded with new nurses, accommodation, a new admissions hospital, and many other buildings were added. After World War II, the hospital was passed over to the newly formed National Health Service and it was now at its most populated. More expansion work was needed and the hospital site grew once again. Tragedy struck the hospital when a fire broke out in Schuster Ward and 6 patients were killed. Like many mental hospitals of its kind, St. Crispin's closed in 1995 when the changes to the Mental Health Act took effect. Since its closure, much of the site has been developed, including a new psychiatric hospital, a large retirement village, a primary school and lots of new housing. There is still a large part of the derelict hospital standing amongst the new buildings waiting to be developed or demolished. In August 2014, a fire broke out in one of the large derelict buildings and 70 firefighters fought through the night to bring the blaze under control. There was a second fire in 4 days which occurred at the derelict site. So this is a beautiful old church. We used to be part of the mental hospital. And their headstones that are here, I'm not sure who they are, whether they worked there or whether they lived there or whether they were patients. I've got a feeling they were patients from some of the research I've done. But it is a beautiful little cemetery, beautiful old church, but all the rest of the hospital is now derelict. I've spent some time up here trying to find these headstones, but I managed to find them today. Well, my niece found them and sent me the picture. So this is why I come up to do the video today. Hope you're all enjoying the video. I appreciate you for staying this long. The now abandoned St. Crispin's Hospital was a large psychiatric facility on the outskirts of Duston Village. It was established under the name of Northampton Mental Hospital or the Berrywood Asylum. The asylum closed in 1995 and during its long history was turned over to the military for use in both World Wars. Asylum. At one point it was transferred to the National Health Service, during which it saw its highest population intake and a further extension added to the site, with 2 more female working patient villas being constructed in 1954. It became one of the last major long-stay facilities in England in the 1970s, when part of the grounds of the hospitals were developed. After it closed, the derelict asylum suffered arson attacks, which saw over 80 firefighters respond to an emergency call as a large fire broke out in August 2014 and again in March the following year. While it was operating, several patients were kept and subject to unthinkable treatments and some even died. Nowadays, people are only kept in mental hospitals involuntarily if they are considered to have a severe mental illness that poses a threat to their lives or others. Those who suffer with mental illness can also be put into sheltered accommodation where they are monitored. Psychiatric hospitals can also be used for the criminally insane who have committed crimes as a result of uncontrollable mental illness and thankfully these institutions are much more humane than they used to be. In the Victorian era, mental health diagnosis and treatment was much more cutthroat than it is today. Patients would be admitted for bizarre reasons and were often misdiagnosed as having a mental health problem when they really had a physical impairment. Differences scared people in the 1800s. Those who looked or acted different were believed to be unwell and put away out of sight. Learning difficulties, physical ailments, and emotional distress were all good enough of a reason to be thrown into asylum, no matter how old the individual was. And asylums were not fun places to be. They were often dirty and dark, like some kind of punishment for being mentally unwell. Thankfully, the mental health institutions in Northamptonshire today have much happier stories to tell, like Meg Allard, who was discharged from St Andrew's Hospital last year after a successful course of treatment. But looking back in history, there are some harrowing stories from former patients who lived and died in the now abandoned St Crispin's Hospital. Mabel Eva Atkins. According to records, Mabel was admitted in St Crispin's on February the 5th, 1889. She was just 6 years old. Her notes are brief and claim that she was taken to St Crispin's because of a diagnosis of idiocy. In 1886, the Idiots Act enabled the building of idiot asylums or mental deficiency colonies, but idiocy was a blanket term for several learning disabilities we now know as conditions such as ADHD and dyslexia. Mabel would have been held in a block built in 1887 as a result of the Idiots Act, next to the female wing at St Crispin's. She tragically died at the asylum less than 9 months after her admission on November the 1st, 1889. The cause of her death is not noted, however it is unlikely that the child died from idiocy, but poor hygiene and abuse are more likely to be the cause. Not only was there no running water, no circulating air, and no heat in these asylums, but cruel attendants would often beat or even kill inmates, sometimes in front of other patients. This would have been the sad truth for many patients, like Mabel admitted during this time. Just a few years older than Mabel was Stephen, who was admitted to St Crispin's in 1882 at the age of 13. His notes reveal that the teenager had sustained a supposed caused injury to head and had a form of mental disease, idiocy. Stephen was a labourer's son with a bad prognosis. This could mean that while working with his father, he'd been involved in an industrial accident, which, being from a working class family, he couldn't afford the treatment for. Head trauma can result in concussion, symptoms of which can be confusion, sickness and memory loss, all of which could have been taken as signs of mental illness and resulted in the referral to St Crispin's. There was a variety of therapies used in the asylum in the 19th century, including moral therapy. This program evolved in the hospitals and encouraged patients to work in trades they knew before they were admitted into the facility. There is no comment in Stephen's record that states when he died or where, but unfortunately it was more common than not that patients died in the asylum. John Alma Johnson. On the 5th of September 1901, St Crispin became the home of John, a 41-year-old described in his notes as demented, restless and resistive. He suffered from hallucinations and a refusal to eat, both of which we now know to be symptoms of schizophrenia, paraphrenia, additions and trauma to the brain, such as a tumour. His weight was 8 stone 4 pounds, and his hallucinations were allegedly of seeing devils in his bed. He was covered in bruises, scratches, and was in poor condition, as he was refusing to eat. Sadly for John, schizophrenia was not a medical term used until 10 years after his referral to St. Crispin's by a Swiss psychiatrist, Eugene Bleuer, and eating disorders were also unheard of in the medical world. Without the proper medication and treatment, John would have declined, and it can be assumed he died from starvation. Even though it is not noted on his record, he did in fact die in the asylum, although the date was not revealed. Herbert Atkins. Historically, those with epilepsy have been some of the most shunned and degraded members of society. The illness, which can cause convulsions, seizures, and erratic behaviour, was often mistaken for aggression or possession, and many believed that it was seriously contagious. Inmates in asylums with this illness would be restrained and bound. Herbert Atkins, who arrived at St. Crispin's on September 26, 1912, was just 12 years old and was diagnosed with epilepsy. Between the years 1861 to 1900, 65% of patients suffering from epilepsy died in asylums, and this was the same for Herbert. Just 6 weeks after his admission, he died. Herbert most likely died from a seizure and lack of proper medication to treat his condition. Today, those diagnosed with epilepsy would not see a psychiatric specialist, but would be treated at a general hospital. The Victorian Mental Asylum has the reputation of a place of misery where inmates were locked up and left to the mercy of their keepers. But when the first large asylums were built in the early 1800s, they were part of the new, more humane attitude towards mental health care. The Berrywood Asylum in Northamptonshire was one of the first of the new state asylums, and it set many of the standards for the mental health care in the Victorian age. Before asylums, people with mental illness or learning disabilities were cared for almost entirely by their families. Those who could not be kept at home often ended up destitute, begging for food and shelter. By the 1700s, there were a few private institutions where wealthy families could send their mad relatives to be cared for with discretion. The poor had to rely on local parishes, which sometimes provided charity-funded asylums, and some ended up in workhouses or prisons. The use of physical restraints in asylums. The commonplace use of physical restraints on patients has its roots in the custodial nature of early asylums. The function of mental institutions was simply to keep inmates in custody. The keepers were little more than guards, and it was not uncommon for patients to be kept in chains or other restraints for most of the time. The extent to which restraints were used varied from one asylum to another, but they were accepted as a necessary part of mental health care. There were several justifications for the use of such restraints. Restraints could control antisocial behaviour, such as tearing clothes and exhibiting lewd or sexual behaviour.